Hello and welcome. You're watching Coronavirus Facts versus Myths. I'm Rishika Barua. After a call to cut the Covishield dose gap, the government has clarified that there is no plan to reduce the current 84-day dosing gap for Covishield. India has an 84-day Covishield gap, but the Oxford-AstraZeneca dosing gap in other countries is less. In the UK, it's 8 to 12 weeks for population below the age of 60. For population above the age of 60, it was brought down to 6 to 8 weeks. In the EU, it is 4 to 12 weeks. In Canada, it is 12 weeks, and in Australia, it is 4 to 8 weeks. The Indian Association of Preventive and Social Medicine has recommended reducing the dosing gap. But Dr Arora, the chairman of the National Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, denied any rethink for now. The recommendation to relook at the dosing gap also comes at a time when there are reports of breakthrough infections. On the 19th of August, top sources from the Health Ministry told NDTV that Kerala, for instance, accounts for 46% of the total breakthrough infections after the second dose of the vaccine. Now, does this really warrant a rethink? Now, the government's decided not to, but we'll try and break down the details for you. We have Dr. Sunila Garg, member of the Lancet Commission COVID India Task Force and Director, Professor Community Medicine, Maulana Azad Medical College, joining us. We also have Dr. Lancelot Pinto, consultant pulmonologist and epidemiologist from the Hinduja Hospital, joining us. Dr. Pinto, to you first. There were questions over the dosing gap. Once again, the government says no rethink for now. But, we've tried to compare the dosing gap in India with what's happening elsewhere. Also, the reports of breakthrough infections. Do you think we need to relook at the Covishield dosing gap?
Hi, Rishika. Thank you for having me on the show. I think the trade-off is between efficacy versus availability always, right? So if you're looking at efficacy, we know that a longer gap is not a bad idea. It might lead to even a better response. However, during that gap, you are exposing a person to the possibility of getting infected, to the possibility of having a relatively severe infection, because we know that a single dose doesn't necessarily protect to the same extent. So if availability is not an issue, if there is no issue in availability at all, and if the background rate of infection is high, for example, if a certain state is having a surge in cases, it might not be a bad idea to lower the gap between the two vaccines. Also, if there is somebody who is high risk of death, high risk of having severe disease, like somebody who is elderly, in whom you want protection provided by 2 doses versus 1 as soon as possible, that's a particular section or a particular cohort in which lowering the gap between the 2 vaccines might not be a bad idea. So I think it all boils down to availability versus efficacy. So supposing vaccines are not available, then giving a certain section of the population 2 doses while depriving the rest of the population of even a single dose, I think that may not be necessarily a good strategy as well.
Right, but it is, according to your assessment, also then a question of supply. And if the supply side is sorted, then you are also in a certain sense saying that we should perhaps relook at the dosing gap. Dr. Garg, which way would you weigh in? There's been a lot of debate and discussion over the Covishield dosing gap. We've hosted several of those conversations here on the show as well. But there has been a call once again to reduce the dosing gaps. Even though the supply hasn't been, as robust as one would like it to be, which way would you weigh in?
I think, Rishika, it is very important, as has been pointed out, that we have to strategize our vaccine strategy. That means if I was to take an example of Kerala, where we have immunized, 1.9 crore individuals with the first dose, and the second only 70 lakhs. There is a big, huge gap. And we can see how much of the breakthrough infections are happening. So, we have to strategize depending on, how much is the burden of infections and, how much is the seropositivity also. In Kerala, the seropositivity was also low and breakthrough infections are also high. Number of the gap between first and second dose is also, too much. As I said, 1.9 crore versus 70 lakhs. So we have to definitely increase. And this is also the recommendation which went from the public health associations also, that we must look at the pandemic, how it is behaving, because each state is very different. It's like a country in itself. So that's how we need to look at, and we need to reduce the dose gap. Though 12 weeks may sound to be ideal, as it happened in the earlier trial, but then that was a trial which was conducted against the original Wuhan virus. Now we are facing with, a lot of infections with Delta strain. So it is important that we must reconsider the dosage gap between, from the public health perspective, and we need to re-strategize our strategy.
Well, very important. You're raising a very important point, Dr. Garg. Dr. Pinto, do you want to weigh in here? Because what Dr. Garg is saying is that, we also need to look at virus mutations while we talk about the dosing gap. And once again, I just want to tell our producers if we can put out that graphic on what the dosing gap is elsewhere. Because if you look at, other parts of the world that are administering the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, in the UK, it's 8 to 12 weeks. The gap was reduced to 6 to 8 weeks for the vulnerable population, 60 and above. In the EU, it is 4 to 12 weeks. In Canada, it is 12 weeks. In Australia, where, there are pockets of infections emerging, it is 4 to 8 weeks. So, given the Delta variant, do we need to relook at it?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the history of the dosing gaps as well, the dosing gap was initially revised and made longer based on data that a longer gap might lead to more efficacy. But then when the Delta variant arrived in the UK and individuals realized, the Public Health England published its report that it was just 33% efficacy against the Delta variant. That was just one dose had a 33% efficacy. That's when they revised their guideline and said we cannot wait to just have a 33% efficacy while Delta surges in the country.
Yes.
And that caused the shortening of the dose gap. So I think, just as Dr. Garg has said, this is a dynamic process which has to be constantly visited. And I think it's very important to take local factors into consideration. So if the background probability of you getting infected is high, and that would depend on a surge or the outbreak that's happening, you would want 2 doses in as soon as possible. But if the background
Dr.
probability
Garg,
is relatively low,
right,
you might have a window to wait.
Dr. Garg, as a public health expert, I'll ask you a very straight question. Do you think the government's making a mistake here by not reconsidering a revision in the dosing gap? Because after this recommendation was made, the government has come out and said that they are not reconsidering it at the moment.
See, ultimately, I feel from the public health perspective, the government will consider. That is important from this thing also. So, and as I said that, after all, when we all make the recommendations from a public health perspective, definitely the government will keep this situation into mind. And then now we have got a lot of, we are going to have many vaccines in our kitty, like Zycovi-D also is going to come. And also we talked about biological C. They may, they will take some time, but till that time, it is very, very important that we need to look state-wise, as I told you, and from a public health perspective, where, we are having large number of cases and 19% test positivity is not a small positivity. And where, more than 85% cases are in home isolation.
Yes.
But we cannot underplay this. And so that is where, the vaccine becomes, so I think becomes a rescue.
Yes, I think you're raising a very important point, because you're saying that as India diversifies its vaccine basket, perhaps the load on the Covishield vaccine, which is what is largely being administered, becomes lesser. There's more vaccine in supply, and therefore, the government can reconsider revising the dosing regimen. I think that's a very important point that you make. I want to also shift our focus on the show today to the other big milestone story. Well, the government has said that 50% of India's adult population that is eligible for the Covid-19 vaccine has now received 1 dose of the vaccine. Now, this is indeed a milestone. However, studies have shown that both doses are needed for better protection against the Delta variant, which we know is dominant here in India. Now, according to Our World in data, only 10% of the entire population has been vaccinated. So, the government has calculated 50% on the basis of eligible population. And if you look at the entire population, which is not necessary, which also includes children who are not eligible to be vaccinated just yet, then 10% of the population has been fully vaccinated. But let's also look at the vaccine target. And I want to bring that graphic up full screen at the moment. If you look at the vaccine target, we are still falling short of the vaccine target. If you look at those figures right there, our average required rate of vaccination needs to be 11 million on a daily basis. But it is indeed a milestone, 50% of eligible population being vaccinated. We also have Dr. Rahul Pandit joining us on the show. He is a member of the Maharashtra COVID Task Force, Director, Critical Care Fortis Hospitals. Thanks very much, Dr. Pandit, for being with us. 50% population vaccinated with 1 dose according to the government. Do you think we will be able to achieve the target of vaccinating 60% of our population with both doses by the end of the year?
So good afternoon, Rishika. Thank you very much for having me on your show. I think what we need to look at is from the perspective. So you put in both the perspective there. You said 50% is vaccinated. At the same time, you said less than 10% is vaccinated. So I think with the population, the kind of population our country has, we are actually doing a fantastic job. And I would also say, I'm not saying this just to basically please up anybody, but we are almost vaccinating the population equivalent to Israel per day, for example. And that's a huge amount of effort which is going in. Vaccine availability has been a concern, and with every vaccine being given a clearance by the government, we will probably be narrowing that gap down slowly. And I'm believing that we are much better placed than what we were a month ago. And maybe 1 month down the track, we will have more vaccines available for people to be taking in. I don't know whether we'll be able to meet that gap before the 31st of December or not. That's a question mark. We will have to just wait and see how things go. But surely, I think we are progressing in the right direction. We would have loved to have more vaccine available, more stock available within the first few months when we actually wanted to achieve that target. But what's gone is gone. We need to sort of focus on the way forward and see how things can move across.
Dr. Garg, the concern here is that while, of course, it's a milestone, no doubt, that 50% of our population has received, eligible population has received 1 dose of the vaccine. If you look at the state-wise breakup that we've been putting out on our screens, 59.2% of Kerala's population has also received 1 dose of the vaccine, and look at the surge of cases in Kerala. So is 1 dose enough, therefore? And is the protection that 1 dose is giving enough at this stage of our fight against COVID? Dr. Garg.
That's why I was studying, Rishika, that we have to go state by state and view the situation, because 1.9 crores and 70 lakhs having second dose. So there's a huge gap. So there we have to expedite our immunization program, and also with low, positivity in our 4th round of sero survey. What will come to our, as has been pointed out by Dr. Pandit also, that we have to see at the end in December, I will look from the public health perspective, then I have got X number of individuals who have already been infected, and there is no better immunity than natural immunity. That we have to keep in mind. And along with that, we are vaccinating people, and we have also kept a sufficient gap. Actually, if you see it, the person who suffers from a natural infection, if you will see from the science part of it, his memory cells are primed and he does not require a vaccine for quite some time. That is important. Though from the government perspective, we are giving after 3 months, that gap can be further extended. There is no doubt about it. But we should give to more vulnerable population, as I said, that those who have not got any, infection, those who have got only 1 dose of vaccine, so they should be prioritized.
We're still talking about 1 dose, and I know that we can't compare numbers, but vulnerable populations across the world in some countries are now being given a 3rd booster dose. So that's a whole different conversation altogether. Dr. Pinto, I'll give you the last word. The milestone of 50% of our eligible population getting 1 dose, is it really as much a cause for celebration, given the fact that, look at the Kerala numbers, they tell you a whole different story. 59.2% of Kerala has received that 1 dose, but yet their cases continue to spike.
As a clinician, I think, and even as most of our population, I think what we've realized is that the biggest problem with COVID has been hospitalizations, lack of oxygen, that kind of a burden on healthcare, right? And 50% of this eligible population is predominantly the ones who end up in a hospital or who end up needing the healthcare. Younger individuals don't tend to get hospitalized. So 1 dose of vaccine in this 50% of population who could have completely overwhelmed our healthcare system is still a big achievement. And I think we may not be able to achieve cases going down, but as long as our hospitalization and our death numbers remain low, I think it's a cause to be happy.
All right. Well, I'm completely out of time. Thank you all very much for joining us. We're going to slip into a very short break, but up next, Dr. Pandit will continue to be live with us as we answer your questions on the coronavirus vaccine. Stay with us. Welcome back to our special campaign, Vaccinate India, in partnership with Google. Dr. Rahul Pandit, member of the Maharashtra COVID Task Force and Director Critical Care Fortis Hospitals, Mumbai, is with us to answer your questions. Dr. Pandit, the side effects of coronavirus vaccines continues to remain a big question. What are some of the most common side effects, and then what are some of the serious side effects that one must be aware of?
So, if I may say that there are actually no side effects. These are the effects which are expected after any vaccination, not just COVID-19, but even if you take a flu vaccine or a flu shot for normal, you may have a little bit of injection site pain. You may have a bit of fever or fever-like feeling for a day or two, which may be involving body ache, and may you need a paracetamol tablet to be taken. Apart from that, there are no immediate problems. There have been reports of blood clots in the patients who had COVID vaccine taken up initially. They have been well studied and refuted back. The incidence of such clots happening is extremely low, and no correlation can be actually set for vaccine as such causing those clots. So I think we should be very clear that these are not side effects. These are just an effect which a normal vaccination program of any type would have on a person's body, and we have to just accept them and treat them simply with hydration and paracetamol. That's all.
Dr. Pandit, as India diversifies its vaccine basket, we have an mRNA vaccine that's been approved, not being given just yet. We also have approved a DNA vaccine now for emergency use. Does the level of side effects, or like you said, the routine effects of a vaccine, do they vary basis the technology with which the vaccine is made?
Yes, so there are different types of vaccines. We know that there may be a live attenuated vaccine, there may be a dead virus vaccine, and there may be mRNA vaccine. So you will have a little bit of change in the intensity of these mild effects which we see from varying from vaccine to vaccine. But more or less, they don't actually go out of the spectrum which I mentioned. So these are very mild, and we should not be worried about it.
Right. As we once again, debate the Covishield dosing gap, I also want to ask you another important question. How long does it take to develop immunity after a COVID vaccine?
Very good question. Now that we have got 3 different regimes potentially, we've got a 2-dose vaccine approved, which we are using already. We've got a 1-dose vaccine approved, which has not been used yet. And the Zydus vaccine, which is going to come, which is a 3-dose vaccine, which will again come. So we need to wait for 15 days after completing the schedule of that particular vaccine, whichever schedule we are taking up for having a full immunity to be developed.
And how long does this vaccine immunity last? Are we any closer to answering those questions?
So I think we know about, for the Covishield and Covaxin at least, that most people who have taken it in the month of January are still having some form of immunity. We know that from the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine trials which were done abroad, that now the vulnerable population has been offered a 3rd dose.
Yes.
So at least those population which have got a vulnerable population which has got an immune problem in terms of maybe a cancer therapy going on, or they have an immune system problem, there the 3rd dose may be required. But whether it is the same for Covaxin and Covishield, we need to still wait for the data. But certainly mRNA vaccines have been advised that.
Is it true that vaccine immunity wanes quicker in the immunocompromised people?
Yeah, so immunocompromised people actually have got a difficulty in mounting the same amount of response which an immunocompetent might do. And hence we are worried that the vaccine immunity may wane in them quickly. We are also worried that if they catch an infection and if there is a population surrounding them which is not vaccinated, they may pass it on to them. So I think to protect them and their life as well as to control the overall pandemic, it's important to vaccinate the vulnerable group.
Right. No, so I'm talking specifically about booster shots for the vulnerable population. Do you think that that's something that even India needs to consider?
I think that's something which India is considering, and it's been talked about. But obviously the data for that is not very clear right now for the 2 vaccines which we have been using for a long time. So we need to get the data before we can make a comment on a conclusive manner.
Should the booster shot be of the same vaccine, or should the booster shot be of an mRNA vaccine?
That is completely different discussion altogether again. So there is some data to say that the heterogeneous viral vaccines, if we use one before and one after, may actually give a better immunity.
Okay.
But that data needs to be studied a little bit more before a recommendation can be made on that.
All right. Thanks very much, Dr. Pandit, for sparing your time and being with us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.